In the city of Movando, nights like this were made to show off. The biggest mansion on the hill was glowing with golden lights, music spilling out of its wide windows, and expensive cars lined up at the gate. Inside, the air was thick with perfume, laughter, and the sound of glasses clinking. Businessmen in sharp suits shook hands as if the world belonged to them, while women in flowing silk gowns moved gracefully across the polished floors, their jewelry sparkling brighter than the chandeliers above. Every smile was rehearsed, every word carefully chosen, and the unspoken rule was clear. Here, only wealth and power gave you a seat at the table. The long dining table stretched across the hall, covered in fine crystal plates, silver spoons, and dishes so rich they looked more like decoration than food. People spoke loudly about deals, about land, about money, all trying to prove who had the most. It wasn't just dinner. It was a parade of pride. In that house, status was the language, and respect was reserved only for those who could afford it. No one could imagine that tonight, all of it would be turned upside down by the one person they least expected. Do you want me to expand the second scene in the same style, 200 to 250 words, so the flow continues smoothly? Zuri sat at the far end of the long table, her hands resting gently on her lap. She wore a plain, neatly pressed dress, the kind that didn't sparkle under the lights or turn heads when she entered the room. Her shoes were simple, her jewelry almost non-existent, just a small pendant that had once belonged to her mother. In a room where every person seemed to shine with wealth, she was the quiet shadow, the one people's eyes passed over quickly, as though she didn't belong. Some didn't even try to hide their disapproval. Their glances lingered. Their whispers floated across the table. Still, Zuri sat with her back straight. She was nervous, yes, but there was something in the way she held herself, a dignity that didn't need gold or silk to be noticed. Yet the others could not see it. To them, she was the outsider, the girl whose presence was almost an insult to the grandeur of the evening. They looked past her as if she were furniture, or worse, a mistake that had wandered in. But what none of them knew was that Zuri's silence was not weakness. Every time she lowered her eyes, it wasn't because she felt small. It was because she was holding back. She was listening, watching, memorizing every word. Every insult wrapped in a laugh, every glance that tried to make her feel less than she was. And though her heart beat faster with every mocking smile, she refused to let it show. She knew something they didn't, something that would soon change the entire room. For now, she sat quietly, unnoticed among the polished shoes and sparkling gowns, waiting for the moment that would turn their arrogance into shock. Do you want me to move on and expand scene 3? The first mockery next in the same style? Around 350 words? It started small, like a spark in a dry field. One of the cousins, dressed in an expensive suit and showing off his gold wristwatch, leaned over to glance at Zuri's phone. The screen had a small crack on the corner, the kind that came from being used for too long, from holding on to something instead of replacing it every season. He smirked, his voice dripping with mockery as he said loudly, "Is this really what you bring to such a house?" His laughter carried across the table, sharp and cruel, and in seconds others joined in. The sound of their chuckles filled the air, bouncing against the high walls of the mansion. Some covered their mouths, pretending to be discreet, while others laughed openly, enjoying the humiliation like it was part of the evening's entertainment. To them, her cracked phone was proof that she didn't belong here, proof that she was beneath their polished world. Zuri felt her cheeks grow warm, her heart pounding hard against her chest. She wanted to shrink, to disappear, but she didn't move. She gripped her hands tightly under the table, nails pressing into her palms, reminding herself not to break. She lifted her eyes just for a second, meeting the cousin's mocking gaze. There was no smile on her face, no comeback on her lips, but the way she looked at him made him falter for just a moment, though he quickly laughed again to cover it. Around the table, no one defended her. Some avoided looking at her altogether, as though silence was safer than kindness. Others leaned closer to each other, whispering, pointing, enjoying her discomfort. In that moment, Zuri was the easiest target, and they chose to shoot arrows at her dignity. But deep inside, she held her silence like a shield. They thought they were breaking her, but they were only building the moment she would rise. Do you want me to continue with scene 4? The whispered insults in the same detailed, emotional style? The waiters moved gracefully around the table, placing dishes of roasted meat, golden rice, and steaming bowls of soup before the guests. The rich aroma filled the hall, and people began to eat with the same pride they carried in their clothes and their laughter. But as the plates landed in front of Zuri, so did the whispers. One aunt, draped in layers of gold bangles that clinked with every movement, leaned slightly toward another woman. Her voice was low but not low enough. "She probably can't even afford a proper meal," she hissed, her lips curling with contempt. The other woman smirked, lifting her glass as if to toast the cruelty. The words rippled around the table like poison. Zuri heard them, every single one. Her eyes dropped to her plate, staring at the food she suddenly didn't feel hungry for. Her fingers tightened around her fork, but she said nothing. Her throat ached with unspoken words, her chest heavy with a fire she couldn't release. More whispers followed, each sharper than the last. "Look at her dress. Simple, too simple. She must be here by mistake. Who invited her anyway?" They spoke as if she wasn't sitting right there, as if her silence made her invisible. Every laugh that followed stung, every side glance cut deeper. But even as her heart burned, Zuri kept her head lowered, hiding the storm behind her calm face. She reminded herself to breathe, to endure, to wait. She knew that responding in anger would only give them what they wanted, a reason to call her small. So she held back, letting their arrogance pile up like dry wood on a fire they didn't know she controlled. For now she stayed silent. But deep inside, her silence was not surrender. It was the calm before the moment they would never forget. "Do you want me to move on and expand scene 5? The command to leave in the same emotional and viral flow, 350 words? The laughter and whispers had already bruised the air, but what came next broke it apart completely. One uncle, a man known in the family for his loud voice and his bigger ego, leaned back in his chair with a scowl. His heavy rings clinked against his glass as he set it down, and then, without warning, he slammed his hand on the table. The sound echoed across the hall, silencing even the clinking of forks. "Why is she here?" he demanded, his voice booming, filling every corner of the room. His eyes, sharp and full of disdain, were fixed on Zuri. "This is not a place for beggars. Let her leave." The words cut through the room like a blade, cruel and merciless. For a moment no one moved. The guests froze mid-bite, their spoons hovering in the air. A few covered their smiles with napkins, others looked away as if the shame wasn't theirs to witness. But everyone felt it. The sting of his words, the humiliation he had thrown at her like a stone. Zuri's breath caught in her chest. She didn't flinch, but inside the words tore at her. It wasn't just the insult. It was the way he said it, so freely, so boldly, as if her very presence was dirt on his polished shoes. Around the table, whispers began again, softer this time but just as cruel. Some nodded in quiet agreement, glad someone had finally spoken aloud what they had been thinking. The uncle leaned forward, his voice colder now. "People like her do not sit at this table." His statement was final, heavy, meant to end the matter with her humiliation and exit. The weight of the moment pressed on Zuri, but even as her hands trembled under the table, her spirit refused to bow. She could feel every eye on her, waiting to see her break. What they didn't know was that this was the very moment she had been holding her silence for. "Do you want me to expand scene 6? The silence that followed next in the same tone, 350 words? All at once, every head at the table turned toward Zuri. The uncle's words still hung in the air, sharp and raw, and the silence that followed was almost painful. A few cousins hid their laughter behind their hands, their shoulders shaking with cruel amusement. Others pressed their lips together, pretending to be focused on their plates, too cowardly to meet her eyes. The room was no longer filled with the sound of music or chatter. It was filled with the heavy weight of humiliation, a silence that seemed to stretch forever. Zuri sat frozen, her hands trembling slightly beneath the table where no one could see. Her fork slipped against her plate, the sound echoing louder than it should have, but she quickly steadied herself. Her heart was beating fast, her face warm, but she kept her chin lifted just enough to show she hadn't broken. Inside, every word replayed, burning like fire, but she refused to let it consume her. She glanced around the table. The women in silk gowns, the men in tailored suits, the relatives who once smiled at her father now looked through her as if she were nothing more than a mistake in the room. No one stood for her. No one said, "That was wrong." Instead, the silence became a stage where her pain was their entertainment. For a moment, Zuri thought about walking out, about ending the humiliation herself. But something deep inside her refused to move. She remembered her father's words, that dignity is not in what people give you, but in what you refuse to let them take away. Her spirit straightened even as her hands shook. She would not let them see her bow. They thought she was powerless. They thought her silence meant defeat. But Zuri was only gathering the strength for what was to come, the truth that would turn this silence into the loudest shock of their lives. Do you want me to now expand Scene 7? The moment of decision in the same emotional viral style, 350 words? Zuri sat in that heavy silence for a moment longer, feeling every eye burn into her. Then slowly she pushed her chair back. The sharp scrape of the wooden legs against the polished floor cut through the quiet like thunder. Heads turned. Some leaned forward eagerly, expecting to see her lower her head and walk out in shame. The uncle who had insulted her smirked, certain his words had won. But Zuri did not move toward the door. She rose to her full height, her simple dress falling gracefully around her. She wasn't dressed in silk, she wasn't covered in gold, but in that moment she looked taller than anyone else in the room. Her hands no longer shook. She lifted her chin, her back straight, her presence commanding without force. The whispers began again, nervous and confused. Is she leaving? Why is she just standing there? But then she spoke, and her voice, though calm, carried enough weight to silence the room in an instant. I will not leave, she said, each word steady, deliberate. Not because of your approval. Not because of your permission. I will not leave because this house, this table, these walls you sit under, they are mine. The words struck like lightning. Forks slipped from hands, glasses paused midair, and the smirk on her uncle's face froze as if carved into stone. No one moved, no one breathed. For the first time that night, Zuri wasn't the outsider. She was the center, and the ground beneath their pride had begun to crack. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't need to. Her calm was louder than their arrogance, her truth stronger than their laughter. And in that moment every single person knew. The game they thought they controlled had just changed forever. Do you want me to continue with Scene 8? The truth revealed in the same dramatic and emotional flow? 350 words? Zuri let her words hang in the air, steady and sharp, and for a moment no one seemed to believe what they had just heard. The glittering laughter, the whispers, the arrogance. All of it died in an instant. Every head turned toward her, eyes wide, jaws tightening. She did not flinch. Instead, she let the silence press harder, forcing them to sit with her truth. This house you are sitting in, she continued, her voice smooth but powerful. The very walls you are leaning on, the roof above your heads, the ground beneath your feet, all of it belongs to me. Gasps echoed around the table. A glass slipped from one of the cousins' hands and shattered on the floor. The aunt who had mocked her for not affording a proper meal choked on her drink, coughing as though her own cruelty was now suffocating her. But the most dramatic change was on the uncle's face. The arrogant smirk that had carried so much pride just seconds ago dissolved. His lips parted slightly, his brows furrowed, and for once, he had no words. Whispers broke out, confused and frantic. What does she mean? Is this true? How could she? They looked at each other for answers but found only more uncertainty. The room that once treated Zuri as an outsider now felt like her stage, and every second stretched with the weight of her revelation. Zuri stood tall, her eyes moving slowly across the table, meeting each shocked gaze. She wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for every time they had mocked her, every insult they had thought she would swallow. Her truth wasn't loud, but it was undeniable, and it crashed through the mansion stronger than any shout could. The house was hers, and at that moment, everyone at the table realized they had been dining not as hosts, but as guests. Do you want me to continue with Scene 9? The shock across the table in the same viral, dramatic flow, 350 words? Forks froze midair, glasses stopped clinking, and mouths hung open as if the room itself had caught its breath. The whispers that had once carried cruelty now died in stunned silence. Every eye at the table was locked on Zuri, their expressions a mixture of shock, fear and disbelief. The laughter that had mocked her just moments ago now seemed to vanish into thin air, leaving only the weight of realization pressing down on them. The cousins who had pointed at her cracked phone and laughed nervously shifted in their seats, unsure where to look or what to say. The aunt who had whispered that she couldn't afford a proper meal pressed her fingers to her lips, as if trying to stop herself from gasping. Even the uncle, the one who had slammed his hand and demanded she leave, leaned back, his face pale, his arrogant confidence gone. For the first time that night he felt small, exposed in front of everyone. Eyes darted to the corners of the room, as if hoping to find someone who could confirm this wasn't true. But Zuri stood there calmly, her posture unshakable, her gaze steady. The reality of it hit them harder because she didn't need to shout, didn't need to prove herself further. The quiet certainty in her voice carried more weight than all their laughter and mockery combined. The room, once filled with the sound of pride and arrogance, now seemed heavy and hollow. The very people who had treated her like an outsider, like someone beneath them, now realized the truth. The girl they had mocked, the one they had assumed had nothing, was the rightful owner of the house. Their laughter had built a stage for her triumph, and in that moment they were powerless, swallowed by their own disbelief. Zuri didn't gloat. She didn't rush to remind them. She simply stood, letting the truth settle over the table like a quiet storm. Every second stretched as the reality sank in. The poor girl was the one who had been in control all along, and now they were the ones who had not. Zuri reached into the small bag she had kept by her side, her hand steady now, no tremble left. From it, she pulled out a stack of crisp papers, each one neatly arranged, each one carrying the weight of truth. She held them up so everyone at the table could see. The ink glinted under the chandelier light, the signatures bold and final. This was no mistake, no rumor, no exaggeration. "These," she said calmly, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife, "are the deeds to this house, signed in my name. Every brick, every wall, every room, built by my late father, passed down to me." She allowed a small pause, letting the words sink in. The uncle who had mocked her shifted in his chair, his face draining of color. The cousins who had whispered and laughed could only stare, their mouths opening and closing without sound. The aunt who had sniffed at her simple dress now looked down at her own plate, ashamed. The documents were more than paper. They were a mirror reflecting the truth of every insult they had thrown at her. Every laugh, every whispered jab, every pointed finger was meaningless against the weight of history, inheritance, and justice. Zuri's eyes swept across the table, meeting theirs one by one. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't shout. Her calmness, her control, was louder than any words they had thrown at her. The room, once alive with their arrogance and mockery, now felt heavy and quiet, as if the walls themselves were honoring her. The reality hit them slowly, painfully. The house they had treated as a stage for their pride was not theirs. They were sitting in the home of the girl they had tried so hard to humiliate. And she was not only its owner, she was the one who now held all the power. No one spoke. Some looked away, some stared in disbelief. And Zuri, holding her father's legacy in her hands, realized this was the moment she had been waiting for. The moment her silence and patience turned into undeniable truth. "Do you want me?" The room was thick with tension. The smugness, the laughter, the whispers, all of it had vanished, replaced by an awkward, suffocating silence. Slowly, hesitating as if afraid to speak, the same people who had mocked Zuri began to mumble apologies. I'm sorry, Zuri," one cousin stammered, eyes darting to the floor. We didn't know," another added, voice barely audible. Their faces burned bright red, shame replacing the arrogance they had worn like armor just moments before. But Zuri didn't move, didn't nod, didn't offer forgiveness. She had no reason to. Their words, though polite now, were too little too late. Every cruel laugh, every pointed finger, every whispered insult had already revealed the truth about them. Their hearts, their pride, and their inability to see a person for who they truly were. Their character had been exposed, and no apology could rewrite the story they had written themselves into. Some tried to cover their shame with awkward smiles, glancing at each other as if hoping someone else would carry the embarrassment. Others avoided her gaze entirely, pretending they weren't responsible, but Zuri could see it all. The fear, the regret, the disbelief that the poor girl had outshone them without a single raised voice. The atmosphere had shifted completely. The power had moved from their arrogance to her quiet strength. She didn't need to say anything else. The house, the documents, and the way she carried herself spoke louder than any words. They had built their pride on the assumption that she was weak. That assumption had crumbled, leaving them exposed and powerless. Zuri finally sat back down at the head of the table, her posture calm, almost regal. The apologies continued, stumbling out awkwardly, but she let them be. Her victory was not in forcing them to bow or shout. It was in showing, without anger or malice, that she had always been in control. That night, the table turned. And Zuri was the one now holding all the cards. Zuri stood for a moment, letting the weight of the room press against her. Every pair of eyes was fixed on her, some filled with guilt, others with disbelief, and a few still struggling to understand that their mockery had been powerless against her truth. The uncle who had shouted at her, the cousins who had laughed at her cracked phone, the aunts who whispered insults about her dress, all of them were frozen in that quiet storm she had created. Then with a slow, deliberate movement, Zuri turned and walked to the head of the table. Her steps were measured, graceful, each one echoing softly against the polished floor. She didn't rush, she didn't stomp in anger, and she didn't need to. The room itself seemed to notice her presence shift. The arrogance that had once filled the air now felt hollow, and the confidence that had belonged to others had quietly slipped away. When she finally reached the head of the table, she pulled out her chair and sat down. She didn't gloat, she didn't smile triumphantly. She simply adjusted her posture, placed her hands lightly on the table, and lifted her chin just enough to meet every gaze in the room. That quiet calm, that simple act of taking her place without a word of malice, spoke louder than any insult they had thrown at her. The silence that followed was different this time, not heavy with cruelty, but heavy with respect and the undeniable truth of her dignity. Every apology whispered before, every guilty glance, every attempt at pretending none of it had happened, now paled in comparison to the quiet power she carried just by sitting there. Zuri didn't need to prove anything. She didn't need to shout or cry out. Her presence alone, calm and poised, was enough to remind everyone that dignity isn't given. It is claimed. And in that moment she had claimed hers completely, leaving no doubt who truly owned the room, the house, and the respect that had once been denied to her. Do you want me to continue with scene 13? Yes. Within days, Zuri's story had spread across every corner of Movando. People spoke of her in hushed tones on crowded buses, in the colorful markets where vendors shouted over the noise, and in the small cafes where friends leaned close to share the latest gossip. Did you hear about the girl they mocked for being poor? Someone would ask. She actually owns the whole house. And just like that, the tale grew, whispered from mouth to mouth, impossible to ignore. In the beauty salons, women paused mid-braid or mid-hair wash to share the story with wide eyes and shaking heads. In classrooms, teachers used it as a lesson, not about money or status, but about courage, patience, and dignity. Children repeated the story to one another at lunchtime, their voices full of excitement as they imagined Zuri standing tall, her calm defiance silencing everyone who had laughed at her. Even those who had been part of the dinner could not escape the tale. The cousins who had mocked her now found themselves facing awkward glances from neighbors, distant relatives, and business associates who had heard the news. The uncle who had demanded she leave the table could no longer hold his head high in public. His arrogance had become a cautionary tale, and every whisper of Zuri's victory reminded him of how wrong he had been. But for Zuri, the story was not about revenge. It was about the quiet strength she had shown, the patience she had held, and the dignity she had refused to let anyone steal. The city of Movando didn't just learn that she owned the house, they learned that one person's courage could shatter pride and arrogance, that true power did not come from wealth alone, and that kindness and patience often hide the greatest strength. In every corner of the city, people repeated her story with awe, admiration, and hope. The girl they had mocked for being poor had become a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even in a world obsessed with status, dignity and truth could never be. The uncle who had slammed his hand on the table and demanded Zuri leave could no longer walk through the streets of Movando with his usual pride. Everywhere he went, whispers followed him. Neighbors, shopkeepers, even casual acquaintances repeated the story of the girl he had tried to humiliate. His arrogance, once his armor, had become his undoing. He avoided gatherings, canceled invitations, and sat quietly at home, unable to meet anyone's eyes without remembering the moment he had been proven wrong. Every interaction reminded him of Zuri's calm strength, her quiet confidence, and the way she had claimed what was rightfully hers without a single shout or insult. The tables he had expected to dominate, the people he had hoped would admire him, now saw him as someone small, foolish, and short-sighted. The laughter and mockery he had so easily tossed at her now echoed back at him, sharper and colder, as if the city itself were punishing him for his cruelty. Meanwhile, Zuri's reputation grew brighter with every retelling of the night. People admired not just that she owned the house, but how she had carried herself through insult and humiliation. Her strength became a crown, invisible but unmistakable, resting on her head with the weight of respect, dignity, and justice. She didn't flaunt it, she didn't need to. Every calm step she took, every patient moment she held, reminded everyone that true power came not from shouting or mocking, but from believing in yourself and standing tall when others try to push you down. The contrast between the two could not have been clearer. One's pride had turned to shame, while the other's quiet courage had become legend. The uncle's regret was private, bitter, and inescapable, while Zuri's victory was public, celebrated, and unforgettable. Every time someone spoke of the dinner, they remembered her poise, her dignity, and the undeniable truth she had carried into that room. A truth that changed not just her life, but the way Eve. In the end, Zuri didn't just own the house. She owned something far greater. She owned her dignity, the kind that cannot be bought or mocked away. She owned her worth, the quiet knowledge that no insult, no whisper, no cruel laugh could ever take away what was hers by right. And she owned her voice, calm yet powerful, the voice that had spoken truth and silenced arrogance without ever needing to raise itself in anger. The night that had begun with humiliation and mockery had turned into her moment of triumph. Every person who had doubted her, laughed at her, or tried to make her feel small now knew the truth. Zuri's strength could not be measured by the clothes she wore, the phone she carried, or the money in her pocket. Her strength was in her patience, her courage, and the way she refused to bow to cruelty. Word of her victory spread far beyond the walls of the mansion, reaching every corner of Mavando and beyond. People spoke of her as a symbol of resilience, a reminder that one person's quiet confidence can shake even the proudest halls of arrogance. And Zuri, sitting in the home that had been hers all along, felt a peace that no wealth or praise could give. She had shown the world that true power isn't taken by force. It is claimed with patience, courage, and dignity. That night, the girl they had tried to humiliate became a woman everyone would remember, not just for owning a house, but for showing the entire country the unstoppable strength of her spirit. This completes your full 15-scene, emotionally charged and viral-ready script. If you like, I can also compile all 15 scenes into one seamless 4,000-word script ready for publishing or storytelling, with smooth transitions and consistent tone. Do you want me to do that?